All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining Network 2020 for this discussion about the future of the Middle East. Just a really quick background about Network 2020. We are a New York City-based nonprofit, and we bridge the gap between the private sector and the international affairs communities by bringing top experts to illuminate critical topics that are shaping our world. Today, on this 23rd anniversary of the September 11th attacks, we are fortunate to have Dr. Stephen Cook back here to talk about the future of the Middle East. And for those who were impacted by the attacks and the subsequent wars, you are in our thoughts on this somber anniversary. I myself was a college senior at NYU on September 11th, living in downtown New York. And at our graduation that year, one of the speakers likened our generation to that of ancient Athens when attacked during the Peloponnesian Wars. Her point lay in the ripple effects of the attacks and of the ways in which societies and regions are reshaped by these events. September 11th changed the United States, and it also changed the Middle East. And today we are very fortunate to have back with us Dr. Stephen Cook, Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is also the author of the recently published book from Oxford University Press, The End of Ambition, America's Past, Present, and Future in the Middle East. So welcome back to Network 2020, Stephen.
Thanks so much, Courtney.
So in your book, The End of Ambition, you explore American foreign policy in the Middle East in the immediate aftermath of the attacks. As you might recall, and I recall, the conversation really centered around, as Fareed Zakaria put it, why do they hate us? And they was not just radicalized al-Qaeda, but also the broader society that seemed to have a distrust and dislike of the West. So looking specifically at the Middle East, as we reflect on September 11th and its aftermath, how has U.S. policy impacted radicalization in that broader culture in which it sits?
Yeah, it's a very, very important question, Courtney. And those ripples, those third, fourth, fifth, sixth order effects on the region as a result, both of the post 9/11 American foreign policy in the Middle East, as well as the debates that preceded it, led to a very difficult decade for the United States in the region, but also had a tremendous impact, obviously, on the people of the region. And in the immediate aftermath, yes, Fareed Zakaria asked, why do they hate us? And there were, multiple answers to those questions, none of which were actually satisfactory. But nevertheless, the Bush administration took it upon itself to say they hate us because of our freedom, of our democracy. At some level, when it came to al-Qaeda and other extremist groups in the region, he was right. For al-Qaeda, for transnational jihadism, for the theoreticians of transnational jihadism, democratic laws, ideas, principles, and institutions are illegitimate because they have not been handed down by God. And the only place to find those laws to organize society are in Islamic scripture. But nevertheless, the administration went about making that part of the world, or trying to make that part of the world look more like us, in an effort to, in their words, drain the swamp of those people who would take up arms against their own state, as well as the United States, as we saw tragically on September 11th. What this meant was pursuing a policy that sought to advance democracy in the Middle East at a level of abstraction that's not necessarily such a bad thing. It doesn't sound so crazy given American history in the world. We saved the world from fascism. We saved the world from Soviet communism. There had been a third wave of democratization in the 80s and 1990s. Why not the Middle East? And there was a security reason to do it. I think the problem with this, of course, was that the administration obviously underestimated the political, the economic, even the cultural obstacles to coming into a region and trying to transform some other society's politics. This, kind of given the history of the region, given the history of the Western encounter with the region just smacked as kind of neo-colonialism to many, even those who were predisposed towards accepting American help were horrified by the idea that the United States was going to promote democracy in the world and change their societies. And so this had, we did this in a number of ways, and one of which was obviously the invasion of Iraq. And the other was this kind of diplomatic effort to promote democratic change in the region, both of which had, I think, Iraq obviously had disastrous consequences for Iraq, first of all, as well as the region. And then for all of the effort that was put into, at least rhetorically, in change, and there was a fair amount of financial resources put towards this effort to alter the political trajectory of countries in the region, the return on investment in both is less than zero. Now, lest you think I'm just picking on the Bush administration, let me just say first at the outset, this is just my objective analysis of what's happened. But in the book, which I conveniently have a copy right here, I demonstrate how this was actually a bipartisan affair. That in the aftermath of both Saddam Hussein's defeat in Kuwait in 1991 and the end of the Cold War, the Clinton administration embarked upon a series of policies that sought to transform the world, including the Middle East. So many of the ideas that were implemented in the post 9/11 world were debated in the 1990s, and even some of those were things that President Clinton and his team sought to do as well. After all, they embarked upon a peace process between Israelis and Palestinians, which was aimed at, one, bringing peace between Israelis and Palestinians, a good, but an underlying logic to this was that once you had peace in the region, it would lead to the transformation of the region, because the rationale for the big national security states throughout the Arab world would disappear, which sounded, I guess, good in a conference room, but in reality, the big national security states of the Arab world have very little to do with the fact that there is a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians over territory.
Thank you. And as a follow-up to that, you spoke about the idea of democracy transforming societies as one impetus for the policies that the administration took. Um, how has that changed? Have we learned any lessons when we're looking at US policy in terms of addressing radicalization today? Is there a different approach? Are there different ideas that are being bandied about in
Right.
conference rooms that may or may not be
Well,
sound?
the approach was, and to put it in a kind of succinct way, was the idea was that if young, primarily men, had the opportunity to process their grievances through institutions that were neutral or represented them, they would be less likely to become radicalized. Uh, the evidence doesn't suggest that that's the case. There have been studies that suggest that neither, authoritarian systems and democracies both produce terrorism, and it's a much more complicated phenomenon than that. We did learn some lessons as a result. I think that the Bush administration sort of pulled back on its very vocal rhetoric about democracy in the region, although it kept its programs going after Hamas won the Palestinian elections in 2006, in which the United States didn't recognize the outcome of those elections. This was something that the United States had pushed. There were those, including within the Palestinian Authority in Israel, who thought this was a very, very bad idea. The polling, if you looked at it carefully, suggested that Hamas might win. The administration decided to push for them anyway. And when they happened, Hamas won not quite a majority, but a plurality of votes in the Palestinian legislature, giving them what would ostensibly have been control over the Palestinian Authority, which was established in 1994. So there was somewhat of a ratcheting back in the effort to promote democracy. But like I said, through new structures created at the State Department at the time, the administration continued to devote financial resources to the issue. When President Obama was elected, he said, look, we're not going to engage in this democracy promotion. If you all become democracies will be there to help you. And lo and behold, after the Arab uprisings, President Obama gave speeches that could have been written by President Bush's speechwriters. President Obama was described to me once by someone who worked closely with him as a realist who felt bad about it. He thought that the idea of transforming other people's societies was not a realistic goal for American foreign policy and would only get us into trouble. But once, Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali fell in Tunisia and Hosni Mubarak was overthrown in Egypt, he put the United States back in the democracy promotion business. And once again, for whatever efforts we expended politically, diplomatically, and financially, the returns on those investments were less than zero. No country, as a result of our efforts, became a democracy. And the one quote unquote Arab Spring success story, Tunisia, wasn't much of a success at the time. It was just something that the administration and friendly journalists talked about. If you spoke to Tunisians, they didn't necessarily think was a success. And now, of course, we're back to a pretty terrible dictatorship in Tunisia. So since then, there hasn't been much in the way of going back to democracy promotion. I know President Biden, when he first came into office, talked about American values, but they didn't really do too much about it. And when it comes to radicalization, there haven't been too many good ideas about what to do about it. I think we've fallen back on kind of an economic determinism, as well as using political pressure on our allies or partners in the region, and have turned a blind eye to our allies in the region and partners in the region to do whatever it is that they think is appropriate in order to undermine extremism. But that doesn't necessarily undermine the appeal of extremism. And in my previous book, which was about the Arab uprisings, called False Dawn, I talk about that this appeal of extremism is actually quite complicated. It has to do with identity. It has to do with ideas about historical narrative, national historical narratives. It has to do with economic grievance, although that was the big story, during the Arab uprisings and discussions of extremism, but that's not the only variable here. So it's much, much more complicated. And I think it's something that we don't, as a country, have tools to really address at quote unquote the root causes. And so we're forever dealing with the results or the symptoms, which requires, police work, intelligence work, and quite honestly, military firepower. I just wish we would do it better than we've done it in the past.
Thank you. Last night in the US, there was a debate. Elections are approaching. How do the candidates differ in their approaches to foreign policy in the Middle East? And do you think that there are relevant aspects of that broader topic that are being left out of the public discourse?
Yeah, I was afraid you were going to ask me that question. It was a rather extraordinary debate overall. There was some firsts in presidential debate history during the hour and a half long conversation. When it comes to the Middle East, I think that there are obviously differences in tone between the candidates, but there are some overlaps between the two candidates. Certainly, it was clear from the two candidates what that difference in tone is like. But the idea that President Trump was uniquely bellicose in the region is really a misreading of what he was trying to do. For example, when it came to Iran and his maximum pressure campaign, this was the president's effort to bring the Iranians to the negotiating table so he could get a better deal than the JCPOA, which was President Obama's deal with them. But it was essentially taking a page from the Obama administration's playbook, which was maximum pressure. That's what Obama did to coax the Iranians to the negotiating table that led to the JCPOA. Now, the question is whether he would pursue maximum pressure now. The Iranians would never go back to the negotiating table with Trump on a quote unquote better deal, though pressure on the Iranians, given everything that has happened since October 7th, 2023, is, I think, an appropriate approach. And there's where you get the overlap between the two. And this is a bipartisan problem in the United States, is that Washington administrations, both Democratic and Republican, have never been willing to directly confront the Iranians for their malign activities in the region. Let's separate out the very messy and very complex Israel Hamas theater, or the less complex but nevertheless still complex Hezbollah Israel theater, and let's look at the Houthis. For the better part of the last 10 or 12 years, our partners, the Saudis and the Emiratis, neither of whom are perfect, but present to me a perfect partner of the United States. Even partners that come close, like Canada, aren't perfect. We have all kinds of disputes with the Canadians. My apologies to anybody Canadian on the line. We like you very much. But for 10 or 12 years, our partners in the region have been saying, look, the Houthis are a problem. They are fanatics. They intend to destabilize the Arabian Peninsula. Now, it is true that the Iranians don't fully control the Houthis, like they have much more control over Hezbollah. But nevertheless, over the course of all of those years, the Iranians have provided the Houthis with capabilities that they never had, or provided them with the technology to develop their own capabilities. This is very, very clear in what Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Lebanese Hezbollah, said on the anniversary of Qasem Soleimani's assassination, by the way, at the hands of the Trump administration. And so because we've been willing to turn a blind eye to this, because we didn't want to directly confront the Iranians, we're now dealing with a much bigger problem than we had before. The Houthis have leverage over international shipping. They have leverage over the Egyptians. The Egyptians' Suez Canal tolls are down 50%. It's one of the primary ways in which the Egyptians earn hard currency, a desperately poor country of 110 million people. This has all kinds of knock-on effects. Yet, even today, we're not engaged in an effort to actually address the Houthis' capabilities to harass commercial shipping in the Red Sea, nor are we willing to address the actual root cause of it, which is the Iranians' ability to supply them with that. And as long as we continue to kick that can down the road, to use a term that's overused in Washington, we're going to continue to have these kinds of problems. And both President Trump in his first administration flinched when it came to confronting the Iranians directly. Credit where credit is due. They took out Qasem Soleimani, but it was a one-off. They didn't continue to address the real problem. The Biden administration spent the first 3 years chasing the Iranians around the Persian Gulf to try to entice them into a new JCPOA. Even today, after it's become abundantly clear that the Iranians are engaged in an effort to, one, destroy Israel, that's not an exaggeration, push the United States out of the region through all kinds of malign activities and destabilizing the region, we've been unwilling to directly confront the Iranians. The mantra in this administration is de-escalation, de-escalation, de-escalation. This is very, very similar to what President Trump did. And at the moment, and even a stunning moment for the Trump administration came in 2019 when the Iranians attacked Saudi Arabia, and the president basically dispensed with 40 years of declared policy in the name of the Carter Doctrine and the Reagan corollary to it. So both administrations are actually, both parties are responsible for this kind of thing. So there's a significant contrast between the candidates, but when it comes down to it, on some crucial issues, it's not that different. Vice President Harris talked about a two-state solution. I bet you President Trump will talk about the deal of the century if he's ever elected president again.
Do a couple of follow-ups, and I'll try to make them somewhat cohesive. One, what would it look like when you say to directly confront Iran? And then two, it almost seems as though there are these two approaches that have been taken over different administrations. And one, with Obama, you had this idea of, let's use the JCPOA, kind of bring Iran into, one take away the nuclear capabilities, but two, along the lines, maybe we're making some more potential avenues for something to happen down the road. And then you had President Trump looking at the Abraham Accords as being something that could sort of reshape or realign actors in the Middle East. Do you see anything coming from that from either a Harris or a Trump administration, or is there just a different approach that they might take entirely?
Well, first, let's think about those 3 points that you made, and then I'll talk about what their approaches would be. First, from my perspective, let's just stay on Yemen. Why is it that the Iranian intelligence vessel that has been helping direct Houthi attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea and off the coast of Aden is still on the surface? I mean, why is it like, why do we allow that to happen? That is just giving them giving them permission to continue to do what they're doing. I think, this kind of ticky-tacky stuff where, we detect that they're about to fire and we fire missiles at them isn't going to deal with the problem. What it does is it basically bogs us down in the Red Sea, spending a lot of money, and that serves the interests of the Chinese rather than actually dealing with the thing. I'm one of the reasons why I wrote this book was I felt that we had used our power injudiciously, if that's a word. We'd used it in Iraq stupidly. We'd used it in places that were stupid. This is something that calls for the use of American force. This is the judicious use of American force. We have a global interest in ensuring freedom of navigation. And we shouldn't let the Houthis and their Iranian patrons have leverage over international shipping and the knock-on effects it has, not just in terms of, Egypt's financial well-being, but again, the further instability of the Arabian Peninsula, the increased costs of shipping, which we don't really feel in the United States, but they do in Europe. More greenhouse gases emitted by ships having to go around the Cape of Good Hope, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It seems to me that we have flinched at this when this is a responsibility that we have taken on in the post-World War II era that is now quite extended, and we're unwilling to do anything about it. The central hunch at the heart of the JCPOA was, even though lots of figures from the Obama administration would deny this, was that this would be a launch pad to new relations with the Iranians. Although after that administration, they were willing to say it. I mean, those quotes from Ben Rhodes and Phil Gordon, who might be the national security advisor in the Harris administration, saying, yeah, that's exactly what we were up to. But no one bothered to ask the Iranians. The Iranians, this is a fantasy that the Iranians want to reciprocate, that the Iranians want a new relationship with the United States. What we see in the Iranians is a pattern of willingness to make compromise in one realm while retaining the ability to continue malevolent activities in the other one. And we see that in spades after the signing of the JCPOA. And we see that today with the new Iranian president saying to the Europeans, hey, look, we want new relations with you. Let's have negotiations. Of course, they've undermined that by the IRGC shipping missiles to the Russians to kill Ukrainians. But nevertheless, this is part of this effort to be seemingly pragmatic in one realm, yet continue malign activity in another realm. So I think, and what I've been saying for months, even before October 7th, is that Washington needs to drop the fantasy that Iran wants a new relationship with it. It's not the case. There's no evidence of it. Now, the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords were very, very interesting. These were a group of countries that had been normalizing over the previous 5 years anyway. I mean, when they talked about opening an embassy in Manama, the Israelis are like, oh, here it is. We've had it here for a while. Like, just open the door. Our embassy is actually here. And the Emirati, there's been a de facto Israeli embassy in Abu Dhabi for some time under the guise of being the Israel representative to a UN agency about alternative energy or something ridiculous like that. It was clearly an embassy in all name only. These countries were interested in normalizing their relations. What the Trump administration did was help seal the deal, because way back in the 70s, the Carter administration and the Reagan administration, beginning in the 1980s, set a precedent that if you make peace with Israel, we'll do good things for you. We'll give you guns, we'll forgive your debt, we'll help you out on stuff. But that's not to diminish the importance of the Abraham Accords. And I think the Abraham Accords are extremely important. I think that one of the striking things about the last 11 months of horrifying warfare in the Middle East is that Israel's diplomatic relations with its Abraham Accords countries are more stable than anybody would have expected. I recently had the opportunity to listen to the Bahraini, the Moroccan, and the Saudi ambassador all talk about normalization in a very open way in a semi-public setting. It was actually an on-the-record conversation. So those things, and so as a result, that is a positive thing that you can expect both administrations to want to extend. I mean, Trump sees himself as the author of the Abraham Accords, and the Biden administration sought to extend it to Saudi Arabia as a crowning achievement for it in the Middle East. So there's no doubt in my mind that both administrations, whoever's the president, will seek to expand the Abraham Accords to Saudi Arabia. And then after Saudi Arabia, I mean, it's basically kind of done, but then the Qataris and the Omanis and whatever.
Thank you. Turning now to another part of your book, you talk about how US foreign policy ambitions in the Middle East are often hampered by the West's dependency on the Middle East for oil and raw materials. So there's sort of a little bit of a tension there. What lessons have been learned since September 11th? And do you think it would be a winning strategy for a presidential candidate to address this issue?
Well, I think it's the question of what's the policy. So when we want to talk to our partners in the Gulf, who are the oil producers, about their human rights records and democracy, and when we're mad at them and we call them pariahs and beyond the pale, but then the global oil market does something that makes it expensive for Americans to fill their gas tanks, then we say, oh, actually, sorry, don't worry about the human rights thing. Let's sign a security pact, those kinds of things. And so I think it's this is our national interest in a stable global oil market intersects with the president's parochial interest in wanting to get reelected. And so I think, and then the other knock-on effect of the values first foreign policy that President Biden talked about in the first months he was in office is that it so rankles our partners who we depend upon to help create a stable global oil market that it drives them to hedge with the Chinese and the Russians, which aren't good for us. So I don't want a president of the United States to drop the idea that we stand for freedom and we stand for democracy. And those are things that animate our public life. But I think we have to be realistic here, and we have to keep an eye on what's most important to us. And that's what I keep talking about in the book. What is genuinely important to us versus what would be nice to have. Sure, it would be great if Mohammed bin Salman was a Democrat, but he's not. And as long as it's going to be, a billion years, I'm exaggerating here, of course, before we decarbonize our societies, we're going to need them. Even though the United States produces 50% more oil than the Saudis, I always have to explain to people, and I'm a political scientist, although, I was the macro TA in grad school. It is a truly global oil market. And so they are important to us. And the Saudis in particular are a swing producer. So my prescription for it is actually, let's just kind of drop I want us to talk about freedom and democracy, but haranguing our partners about human rights only creates more problems for us and never helps the people who are in jail. It never helps them.
Thank you. Switching gears now, turning to the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's obviously a central issue in the Middle East, in U.S. Middle East relations in general. How do you see this conflict evolving in the context of American ambition in the region and also domestic attitudes? There are generational shifts that seem to be happening on what was a linchpin of U.S. foreign policy, which is unwavering support for Israel. And what role do you believe the U.S. should play in the peace process moving forward?
Yeah. So I'm deeply pessimistic about the trajectory of this conflict. I don't see any reason to believe that there's going to be a ceasefire. There is, if only because Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, thinks he's winning and doesn't see a need for a ceasefire. And when I mean winning, I mean in the total war, in the total long war that he's engaged in against Israel. It doesn't necessarily mean, how many of his Hamas guys have been killed versus how many Israelis have been killed. It's, in addition to that, it's the delegitimization of Israel in the eyes of the international community. It's protests on elite campuses throughout the West. It is sucking Israel into a long drawn out conflict that has an impact on Israel's economy, has an impact on Israel's social cohesion. And we see all of those things happening. And so he thinks he's winning. So why would he want to cease fire? From on the Israeli side, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has, taken, endless criticism from seemingly everybody on this. In Washington, I call it the other BDS. BDS is boycott, divestment, and sanctions. The other BDS is BB derangement syndrome. I mean, yes, the trust deficit with Prime Minister Netanyahu is enormous. I mean, people you think would have gotten along with Prime Minister Netanyahu, like President Trump, really didn't get along with him. That's the one thing that I learned from Jared Kushner's book about his time in the White House, is that in the series of elections that the Israelis held while Trump was in office, Trump was actually rooting for this guy, Benny Gantz, who everybody kind of has built up as the guy on the white horse, which he's not actually. And Netanyahu lies, and he's out for his, political future and so on and so forth. But tell me what politician, whether in a democracy or autocracy, doesn't want to stay in power? It doesn't exist. I mean, there's extraordinary acts of statesmanship that we have seen in history, but those are from extraordinary people. And I would not put Prime Minister Netanyahu in the category of extraordinary statesman, even though he likens himself to Winston Churchill, which is sort of hilarious. And so he is, because of his political situation, beholden to radical parties that don't want to cease fire, because a ceasefire would undermine their ability to annex territory in the West Bank, as well as to fulfill their dream of returning to Gaza. You have to destroy Hamas in order to fulfill both of those dreams. And they have made it clear that if he agrees to some ceasefire that leaves Hamas intact, they'll bring the government down, something he doesn't want to do. So what we have now is a competition between one-staters on either side. So there's no ceasefire. And of course, the United States is left in the position that it has often found itself in the Middle East, wanting something more than the parties actually do. And so what this leaves us with is, in Gaza in particular, is the Israelis believe that, they can actually wind down military operations as we've seen them over the last year relatively soon. And we will return to some sort of uglier version of the status quo, the October 6th status quo. But Gaza will be ringed with even more security. There will be Israeli access through what's called the Netzarim corridor, which essentially splits Gaza in two in an east-west axis, as well as Israeli forces down on the south near Rafah, which is a point of contention in these negotiations, which really aren't very serious. Even though if you get, and this is a topic of my new column in Foreign Policy magazine, even if you were to get in some universe a ceasefire, you would still have the Lebanese theater, you'd still have the Yemeni theater, and you'd still have problems on the West Bank. In Lebanon, actually, Israel is the escalation risk because of the imperative returning 80,000 Israelis to their homes in the northern communities and the kind of willingness to give diplomacy a chance. But the Israelis have had a bitter experience with diplomacy. UN Resolution 1701, UN Security Council Resolution 1701 of 2006 was supposed to dismantle Hezbollah and not let any forces other than the Lebanese armed forces and UN peacekeepers south of the Litani River, which is about 18 miles north of the border. And the opposite has happened. Hezbollah is right on the border. Hezbollah has built tunnels underneath the border, et cetera, et cetera. So the Israelis feel that at some point they are going to be compelled to do this. Yemen The Yemenis are going to continue to fire on Israel and Red Sea shipping because it helps them politically within Yemen. And they're ideologically disposed towards fighting Israel. I mean, their slogan is God is great, death to America, death to Israel, damn the Jews, victory for Islam. I met the Houthi spokespeople in 2018 and an unbelievable encounter in Muscat in Oman. And I said to them, you guys believe your flag, your slogan? They're like, oh, absolutely. Like they were doubling down on it. And they said, and if we had room, we'd also add death to Saudi Arabia. So I don't think that there's a lot of reason to believe that the ceasefire, despite what senior officials of the Biden administration say about, oh, if we get a ceasefire, it will mellow out these other fronts. I don't think it's the case. So there's a long war going on in this. There's a long regional war. It's odd. There's like two tracks. Like there's the Gulfies and, they're proceeding. They're not really a party, even though they would like to see Hamas destroyed, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have Israel, the United States, engaged in a fight against Iran and its proxies. And that's going to go on.
Going to try, because I have a couple more questions that I want to get in, but I'm also looking at some questions from the Q&A box, and there's
I'll
some
try
that
to
are
be.
relevant
I mean, this is
right now.
complicated stuff, and I
know it's very
could go on
complicated.
and on and on and on. I'm actually being concise. My apologies.
I know. It's tough. There's a lot to get in there. It's complex. But we do have a questioner who asks, while we're on the topic of Israel, Gaza, if Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, is eliminated, would that be a catalyst for a peaceful settlement?
Well, I mean, I think if the Israelis find Yahya Sinwar and put a bullet in the back of his head, they can declare victory and go home. But there's a leap from killing Yahya Sinwar to a two-state solution. And let me explain why that's the case. Let's assume for a second that October 7th never happened. The Israelis were hip to it, they thwarted it, and whatever. And let's assume for a
second
that you had a Palestinian leadership that was not thoroughly corrupt, not illegitimate, and was capable of conducting a serious negotiation. And let's say you had an Israeli leader who was interested in a negotiation. The Palestinians' minimum demands for peace are things that the Israelis cannot satisfy. The Israelis' minimum demands for peace are things that Palestinians can't satisfy, and they're mirror images of each other. So that's how you get stalemate. And that's what we have. And the United States has spent 30 years trying to alter the interests and incentives and constraints of these parties and has never been able to do it because there are kind of irreducible things that both sides cannot give up for political reasons. And now, okay, let's bring October 7th back into it. If you couldn't do it on October 5th or 6th, what makes anybody think that you're gonna be able to do it after a ceasefire in Gaza? People always say, oh, never let a crisis go to waste, that from crisis comes opportunity. But it's a very American thing to think that from the crisis, the opportunity is a good one. Think about all of these bad actors who are taking this crisis as an opportunity to do bad things, including Israeli settlers to further the annexation of the West Bank, including the Iranian leadership to further undermine Israel's sovereignty. They've now problematized Israel's sovereignty and helped undermine Israel's global standing. I think the director of national intelligence was very clear back in April that the Iranians are helping to fuel protests around the globe. They're not, I mean, they didn't manufacture it from nowhere, but they are giving it life, along with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is present throughout all of these things. I mean, look, I'm an academic by training. It has been 20 years since I defended my dissertation and was actively on a campus other than adjuncting, but there was very little that's happened on campuses since October 7th that has surprised me, given the kind of level of anti-Zionist sentiment that often bled into anti-Semitism. The outside groups like the Iranians and Muslim Brotherhood fronts have only kind of intensified those sentiments. So this is a long multi-front war that is going to go on for some time.
Thank you. In your book, you also talk about just zooming out the changing global order. and how it's challenging US primacy on the world stage. So, looking at the future, how do you see the role of the Middle East changing on the global stage in the next 10 years? And how do you see these larger global dynamics playing out in the Middle East?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And one of the problems with answering the question about the global order is we're clearly at the end of one, but we don't know what the next one's going to look like. And so we have all these things in the middle. It's a very kind of Gramscian way of looking at it. But like I said, I'm an academic. We're at the end of one, the new one hasn't been born, and so all kinds of bad stuff is happening in this in between period. What I do know is that when we say we want to pivot to Asia, it's kind of silly, right? I mean, we live in a world in which we have, at least we've given ourselves global responsibilities. And if you just look at the map from either east to west or west to east, the Middle East is genuinely the middle. And there are things that are important about the Middle East to both us and our competitors in Asia. And so we should have a policy towards the Middle East. And that's my plea in the last chapter of the book, is to say, okay, what should we do? And what I talk about in terms of great power competition is to recognize that if we are going to try to outmaneuver our adversaries in the Middle East, not our adversaries in the Middle East, but our global adversaries in the Middle East, there are things that we do that are kind of like our own goals that we shouldn't be doing. And I talked about it before, the kind of way in which we have unintentionally encouraged our partners to hedge with the Chinese and the Russians. So, for example, when President Trump said after the Iranians attacked Abqaiq and Khurais, these two major oil facilities in Saudi Arabia in September 2019, he said, "Wow, they attacked Saudi Arabia, not us." And everybody in Washington, bipartisan, kind of clapped. The Saudis were freaking out. The Emiratis were freaking out. I mean, there is this, they can go back 20 years with a list of things that we've done that have been to their disadvantage, that have been to the advantage of the Iranians. And so we have to be good to our word if we want them to be on side. And in fact, it was because of that episode that the Saudis are driving a hard bargain. They say, okay, we'll believe you that you are committed to our security and the stability of the region, but now you have to write it down. Now you have to make it formal. It can't just be this kind of gentleman's agreement that has developed over years. It can't just be the Carter Doctrine and the Reagan Corollary. By the way, the Reagan Corollary is actually not written down. You got to write it down. And so we said, okay, we'll do that. And I think that that's a good thing. I think, if the big issue is outmaneuvering the Chinese, then that's something that we should do. The president has wanted to loop normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel into that agreement as the sugar for members of the Senate to swallow a US-Saudi security pact. I don't think before October 7th, that was not a bad idea. It wasn't the greatest idea in the world, but it wasn't a bad idea. If I was sitting next to the president, I'd be like, sure, I can get behind that. Now I think they need to separate it. And if this security pact is really important, then the president should put it on the table before the Senate and defend it. But it's that kind of thing that we should do. We shouldn't be haranguing our partners about Huawei if we don't have anything to offer them. And, Huawei equipment in one place is different from Huawei equipment in other places. So why get upset about Huawei more, generally, and not have anything to offer? So there's a whole host of things that we could do. Let me point out, though, that at a level of abstraction, the Chinese and the United States have a confluence of interests in the Middle East, the free flow of energy resources out of it. But because we're in competition over places like Taiwan and other places, that we can't fully realize what could be a cooperative security partnership in order to ensure freedom of navigation and free flow of energy resources. And in fact, Chinese shipping is not attacked in the Red Sea.
Interesting. A couple of questions here on allies in the region, so I'll see if I can combine them. So one person asks, which Middle Eastern countries do you think could be new meaningful allies of the US in the near future besides Israel? And which strategies should the US use to implement or strengthen those relationships? And someone is also asking about Egypt, which has traditionally played a role in moving toward peaceful solutions in the Middle East, including in partnership with the US. So, where do things currently stand as far as Cairo's priorities for the region, and do they
Yeah,
align with the US?
those are good questions. First, let me, and I do this myself. I misidentify countries in the region as allies, and people at the Pentagon get really mad at you if you do that. So they're partners because they're not treaty allies. Like Turkey is an ally, Saudi Arabia is a partner. It's just one of these Washington things, but you don't want to get dressed down at a meeting at the Pentagon. Excuse me, sir. Anyway, so we have a collection of partners in the region, and we have forged a regional order over many years that includes Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the Qataris, the Bahrainis, the Kuwaitis, and Oman, as well as Israel. Morocco way out on the flank there. That's a big that's a big chunk of the Middle East. What has been a problem in recent years is that the United States has been outside the strategic consensus that we had been trying to build all these years. We've had a couple of presidents in a row that have been quite revolutionary. George W. Bush was quite revolutionary in his approach to the Middle East: democracy promotion, overthrowing regime change, and so on and so forth. And then Barack Obama was revolutionary in his own sense, in that he forged an agreement with the Iranians that he hoped would change the regional order and bring the Iranians into that regional order. And so the fact of those two things have left us on the outside of the consensus within the region. President Biden started out outside the consensus of the region, but gradually has moved back towards being a leader of the kind of regional consensus that we had been forged. High gas prices, obviously the war, those kinds of things have moved him in that direction. I don't know of another country that's a candidate to be like pals with the United States, right? Let's go through it, right? Algeria. Algeria is never going to be a partner to the United States, if only because it was the most thoroughly colonized country on the face of the earth for 130 years. And so it is going to remain basically Algeria, although it gets all its weaponry from the Russians. Libya has disintegrated. Tunisia was often a backwater anyway, and is now, reverted to autocracy. I don't think anybody is interested in forging it. It is a major non-NATO ally, but that was sort of a reward for stuff. Iraq remains unstable. I mean, it is part of the regional order, but it is also outside of it. Syria, obviously not. So the bulk of the region are partners with the United States. And those partners make it relatively easier and relatively less expensive to do the things that we want to do. What their problem is they don't understand what it is we want to do. And they don't believe when we say what we want to do, we're actually going to do. And so it leads to sort of mass confusion among our partners and convinces them that maybe there are other partners. We're irreplaceable on the security front, but China looms large. Russia is even useful to some degree to them. On this question of Egypt, look, my second book was a kind of look at Egypt's political history. And what was fascinating to me was what I discovered in the book was that, whereas the mantra about Egypt is, oh, it's stable and people only want stability there and so on and so forth, is that Egyptians have essentially been in open revolt against the people who rule them at different periods beginning in 1882. And the country has been largely preoccupied with itself since the uprising against Hosni Mubarak. But even without that, even during the long period of relative stability under Mubarak, I think what we saw was the fruits of Anwar Sadat's lies to Henry Kissinger. Anwar Sadat told Henry Kissinger that Egypt was going to be this central force for peace and stability in the region. And there are moments, and Egypt certainly in previous decades was a bellwether of the region. And one of the reasons why the Israelis are so protective of their peace treaty with Egypt is that there can't be a major Arab-Israeli war without Egypt. But at the same time, the country has turned inward on itself, suffering terribly economically, and for a long time hasn't been able to really marshal resources to project its power in the region other than in Gaza. And that's not saying it doesn't have an important role to play in Gaza. I mean, they're the wranglers of the Egyptian General Intelligence is the wrangler of the Hamas military wing, which is now the entire organization. That's not nothing. But the idea that Egypt is this mover and shaker in the region is not the case. And often, just out of deference and not to, piss off the Egyptians, other countries, give them the lead, give them deference, and so on and so forth. And the Egyptians are brought in to stand there for the photo op when they don't really have the resources to bring to bear on many problems in the region right now.
Thanks. And interesting too what you said earlier about the canal funds being sharply reduced too. I'll try to get in a couple more questions. We have a couple that I'll pair as well. So someone wants to know about the role of Saudi Arabia in the region and what they might be able to do to achieve peace in the Middle East. And I'll tack on to that. It's a little bit different, but the IMEC corridor idea from India Middle East corridor and what role that might have in promoting some sort of stability.
Right. I love trains. I had train sets when I was a kid. Saudi Arabia, like I've been hearing for years now, Saudi Arabia is so important. It's central. It's, without Saudi Arabia, you can't do anything. I think that's true. I think, if you're the last two presidents and you walked into the Oval Office and you surveyed the region, you got your briefing on the policy review. The one country that's sort of left standing, one major country that's left standing is Saudi Arabia. I mean, the Emiratis are standing, the Qataris are standing, but they're tiny little people, not little people, little populations. My apologies. My Egyptian friends say, there's more Egyptians in one neighborhood of Cairo than there are Bahrainis, right? So, but Saudi Arabia, a country the size of the United States east of the Mississippi with a significant population, the king, the custodian of the two holy places, awash in oil, makes it influential regardless. But the fact that the major Arab countries around it have been in crisis for so long really elevates the Saudis. And now is the moment for Saudi Arabia to play a role. And, I told you, I saw the Saudi ambassador speak alongside the Moroccan and the Bahraini ambassador the other day, and she's extraordinarily eloquent. I mean, she grew up in the United States. She kind of knows how it goes, and she talked about, and she was eloquent about recognizing, the pain of both Israelis and Palestinians and what needs to happen. A credible, time-limited path to, justice for the Palestinians and a Palestinian state. They didn't take questions. But had they been there questions, I would have raised my hand and I would have said to the Saudi ambassador, I've heard you and other Saudi officials say the same things over and over again. But what is it specifically that you are prepared to do to advance this process? And I'm afraid they don't have a very good answer. I mean, the Saudis, there's a long history of the Saudis pledging money and never coming up with the money. They're not willing to do the stuff with the Israelis publicly that they could do that may potentially move the needle. But I will say that, those folks to the right of Prime Minister Netanyahu, they don't care about normalization. They're against normalization. They're for the land and the Lord. The Saudis are just, just Arabs who, it's a problem for them. That's why I say may. But what the Saudis are practically, and they say, well, we're not going to engage in reconstruction until there is this credible process. Okay, well, what are you going to do to help this credible process? And they're like, that's on you. so like United States, it's on you. Get the Israelis to do it. In a way, I understand that. But if you were really the movers and shakers, if you're really the indispensable Middle Eastern country, if you really do believe in normalization, and normalization is good for Vision 2030, well, then get some skin in the game. Stop hiding behind us while complaining of what incompetent rubes we are. So that's and I'll tell, I've said that to the Saudis, like, what are you prepared to do? And they're actually more like the old Saudis than the new Saudis, they say they are. India and the Middle East card, I think this is super cool. I wish people would pay more attention to it. I think this is kind of a bright spot, right? And what we're missing, because we're focused on other things, China, the war and stuff, is that there is this incredible flow of people and ideas and technology and goods between India, the Gulf, and Israel. And there's something really that's happening there. And I think it was something that was already happening. And I thought, and the whole idea for IMEC comes out of I2U2, which is not a Star Wars character. It was I2, Israel, India, U2, United States, UAE. And like, everybody thought this was a really good idea. And so it is one of those brighter things, but it's been overshadowed by the violence in the region over the last year. So whoever the next president is should absolutely encourage IMEC. So I don't know, do we really need to build more trains? Whatever.
Big train fan myself.
We're not very good at it. The Saudis have better high-speed rail than we do. We don't actually have high-speed rail.
We do not. No, we do not. That's another conversation.
Yes.
In the few minutes remaining, I know you're at the Council on Foreign Relations. Was often this series, I don't know if they still do it, but the President's Inbox.
Excellent podcast by Dr. Jim.
Oh, yes, they still, they do it as the podcast now.
Yes.
That's right. Come January, if you had whichever president's ear, and at the risk of reducing complex topics to something small, what would you most want to see from a new administration in terms of getting to a Middle East where there is a relationship that is somewhat stable and productive?
And serious and productive. Well, I would say I would want on either of the president's reading list the last chapter of my book, The End of Ambition, which basically lays out, here's the 6 things that are important to us in the Middle East. And let's understand what these 6 things are, things that we have a realistic chance of achieving or advancing, and we have the resources to do it. All this other stuff that we've gotten ourselves wrapped around the axle on gets us puts us in a bad place. I'm sort of teasing it because I'd like people to buy it, but it is a mix of old and new things. Whether it's what I call the prime directive in the book, ensuring the free flow of energy resources out of the region, or how to change the U.S.-Israel relationship to make it more constructive and reduce the emotionalism around it, to a dive on why water scarcity in the Middle East is something that we should pay attention to, because it has profound implications for stability in other parts of the world that are very important to us. I dispense with the idea of climate conflicts in Syria and so on and so forth, and that whole stuff that John Kerry was harping on a number of years ago, to look at what is it that we can actually do in that area, and then a whole series of things to talk about when it comes to great power competition. When it comes specifically to the conflict, I finished this book in July of 2023. I had the opportunity in the 3rd week of October to do some, adding to it. But what was gratifying to me is much of what I said was consistent with what was happening and what would happen in the ensuing 10 months. But what I would say, if President Trump or President Harris said to me, Stephen, what is the one thing that you would want to focus on when it comes to this conflict? And I said, I would say, Mr. or Madam President, I would focus my attention. I would use political capital on ensuring that the Israelis do not resettle the Gaza Strip. I think it's a foregone conclusion, even before whoever it is takes the oath of office, that the Israelis are going to reoccupy the Gaza Strip. But resettling the Gaza Strip is another issue, and it's a much more dangerous one. And under present circumstances, it involves ethnic cleansing, and that's a really, really terrible thing, both for the people there, the poor Palestinians who are there, but also for everything that we want to do in the Middle East. You can kiss away everything we want to do if we, sort of oversee resettlement of the Gaza Strip again.
On that note, we're past time. Thank you, Stephen, very, very much for this very informative discussion. Brian, if you could just put in the chat again the link to Stephen's book, so that we can all read it and be prepared.
It's short. It's only 150 pages. So
that's great.
Yeah. I was a mentor
concise,
said to me,
very concise.
When I was first writing it, a mentor said to me, you live between 150 and 220 pages because people just don't read. My previous books were over 300 pages. They were like, people just don't read that much anymore. I'm sure all of you do, but people do.
Exactly.
Anyway, thank you so much, Courtney. This was a lot of fun. The questions were absolutely terrific. I enjoyed it, and I hope everybody has a lovely day.
Everyone have a great day. And just a couple quick notes for those who are still here. We have our next briefing is on the 17th, and that's with Professor Joanna Lewis, and we'll be looking at the China-US green energy race. So please sign up for that one. And then we're also talking to Ambassador McKinley about Latin America and the US elections. And that's a member-only event. And we have an in-person event in New York with Jennifer Hillman, where we'll be talking about trade and industrial policy, and that's with the New York Private Equity Network as well. So we have a lot of great stuff coming up. We encourage you to donate. We encourage you to join if you're not a member, because that is very important to keeping this going. So thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everyone, for attending today, and have a great day.